10 years ago, Syrians rose up against the Assad regime. We'll look at how a peaceful protest turned into a decade-long conflict that's cost thousands of lives and led millions to flee. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the human cost of the Syrian war. In 2011, pro-democracy protests swept the Arab world, toppling a number of the planet's longest ruling dictators. When the Arab Spring came to Syria that year, similar scenes emerged, with thousands of civilians taking to the streets to demand the ouster of Bashar al Assad. But his regime responded with a brutal crackdown that's turned into a decade-long civil war, and there is still no political solution in sight. Hundreds of thousands have lost their lives, millions more have been displaced. More than 80% of the country now lives below the poverty line in what's become one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. So, while the fighting may have eased, it's clear that Syrian suffering has not. Here's Natalie Pahonen.
"2011 was the season of change in the Middle East. Popular uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt challenged decades of autocratic rule. Calls that also echoed in Syria and first came from the town of Daraa. What started as peaceful anti-government protests turned deadly after security forces loyal to Syria's Bashar al Assad started killing demonstrators. The crackdown eventually turned into a civil war with no end in sight. A hallmark of the Syrian conflict has been the profound suffering inflicted on civilians. Caught up in the spiral of violence with nowhere to go. As fighting escalated between regime forces and a splintered opposition and morphed into a wider war that dragged in foreign powers and terrorist groups. Ordinary Syrians have borne the brunt of the carnage. The horror they've endured has been captured time and again for the world to witness. It has led to repeated calls for an end to the fighting and repeated calls for a political solution.
Assad must go.
Assad must go.
Bashar al Assad doit partir.
But peace has proved elusive.
Humanitarian diplomacy seems to be totally impotent. We're getting nowhere at the moment.
Numbers can only tell part of the story, but they are a visceral reminder of the scale of devastation. In 2016, the UN gave its last estimate of the death toll. It stood then at 400,000 killed. This year, it's acknowledged the missing. Tens of thousands of civilians arbitrarily detained in Syria remain forcibly disappeared, while thousands more have been subject to torture, sexual violence, or death in detention. Millions have been forced to flee their homes. About 6 million people have been internally displaced. 6.6 million Syrians are refugees in neighbouring countries. For those still inside Syria, nearly 60% of the population are what the World Food Programme describes as food insecure. These would have once been unthinkable figures, but now they're just part of the toll of this decade-long war. Assad remains in power. Syria remains a nation carved up by conflict. And it's all taken place while the international community has watched on. Alwan was born in the days after the uprising in March 2011. He's part of the generation of Syrian children that has only known war.
نحن كل ما بتجي الطيارة بنخاف. قال بالمدرسة بيقولوا إنه الطيارة قال هي العالم بتسافر فيها. أنا كل ما بشوف الطيارة بتخبي بعرف إنه بدها تضرب تقصف.
His mother was killed in a barrel bomb strike in 2017. The conflict has forced him and his family to move again and again to seek safety. They now call this camp along the Syria-Turkey border home.
أنا لما خلقت الثورة إنه هيك الله رايد، بس لو ماني جاي بهالوقت هيك، لأنه الطلاب المدرسة رفقاتي في بعضهم نزحوا وبعضهم ماتوا وبعضهم لحلق هيك معانا، بقى 2 3 بس.
Alwan's childhood wasn't supposed to be like this. The war has left little unscathed. Not even the earliest memories of a 10-year-old boy. Natalie Pohanen, The Newsmakers.
Now, the human cost of Syria's war is immeasurable. But is there hope that a future generation can reap some reward from the uprising? Joining me now to discuss that, from Doha, Fadel Abdul. He is the chairman and founder of the Syrian Network for Human Rights. In Washington, we have Rania Kisar. She is Chief Executive Volunteer Officer at the Syrian Humanitarian Institute for National Empowerment. And from London, Amar Wakaf, founder and director of Nosos, a think tank focusing on the Middle East and Syria. Thanks all so much for joining us. Fadel, I will start with you. You believed so profoundly in the need for revolution in Syria. You organized, you fought for it. Today, though, you actually admit a military loss, but you say, we never surrendered. What does that mean for Syria today?
I think the revolution will still continue until achieve its final goal, which is a transitional political movement toward regime respect, democracy, and human rights. This is a basic demand for any society, for any population, and also define the failure of revolution only at the military side this is actually part of the fact. The revolution I think in many factors, and the revolution is win. At the human rights level, all the report from the UN General Assembly, all the human rights organization condemn the crimes of Assad regime, except the UN Security Council, and we know why it's that. At the media level, the revolution is win. There is no respectful journalist can admit or praise Assad regime. At political level as well, I'm talking about the liberal democratic countries. No one can visit Assad. So Assad actually under this intensive pressure due to revolution and due to committing crimes against humanity and war crimes. Also, we will also, due to those crimes, economic sanction being imposed against Assad. That means this regime is a denial regime, and it will remain the same. So rehabilitate Assad is actually, I think it's in vain.
Okay.
The revolution is not surrendered due to the spiritual and due to the large figures of the victims.
Okay.
We are talking about millions of Syrian victims. They will continue their fight toward democracy.
Right. Fadel, I'll pick up on some of the points you made in just a second. First, let me get to Rania. Rania, you've also said, revolutions never fail because they are based on principles and demands that are needed to sustain peace. It's a beautiful sentiment, but what do you say to the critics who argue your idealism lacked realism, and that cost Syria millions of lives and is still costing lives?
Okay. First of all, thank you very much to TRT World for hosting us here to talk about the 10th anniversary of the Syrian Revolution. And I hail and salute my colleagues who are also working on helping the living situations of the Syrian people. And second of all, I don't understand why we are saying that the Syrian Revolution has failed. On the other hand, if we look at the Assad achievements, we will realize that it is he who failed. It is Bashar who failed. Let's talk about realities and step away from sentiments. I agree with you. Let's talk about Assad and what he has achieved in the last 10 years. In the last 10 years, he killed his people. 13 million people are now displaced. In the last 10 years, he has annihilated 80% of the country. In the last 10 years, he was able to achieve that the Syrian pound has deteriorated and is now at 4,000 pounds to the dollar. In the last 10 years, he was able to sustain his presence through the soliciting help of Russia and Iran and Hezbollah. He had to use other countries so he can stay president. He had to get the help of Iran. He had to get the help of Russia. He had to get the help of Hezbollah. And it was not him who was able to keep him in office. It was actually Qasem Soleimani who was able to keep him in office. The Syrian revolution didn't lose, and the Assad regime is not staying. They're not staying. There's no way that this regime can sustain a country and they can't get them bread. They can't get them fuel. And they're also, the Assad regime, they're also trying to manipulate the international world by trying to solicit sympathy and saying that the American sanctions are actually hurting the Syrian people, which is not true. Because the sanctions are not on food or medicine or water or necessities. The sanctions are actually on the people that are using the money to buy more weapons and to kill more Syrian people with it. So the answer is the Syrian revolution didn't win and Assad is not staying. I'm sorry, I want to say the Syrian revolution did not lose and Assad is not staying.
Fair enough. I need to bring Amar into this discussion. Amar, you actually argue this was never a revolution and that the desires of some only served to spark a civil war that was doomed to fail because it pitted Syrians against Syrians. So what do you make of what you've heard from your fellow panelists here?
Well, thanks for having me and for summarizing my position. Yes, indeed, the way I see it, and actually I believe many Syrians do as well, is that this was never an all-Syrian movement towards bringing better governance or better democracy. This was many Syrians from day one suspected motives behind the mobilization, suspected motives of regional powers who were supporting this mobilization and so on. And so either they said, okay, we're not going to participate in this, or they said, well, this is going to hurt us, so we're going to stand against it, and they formed some line of defense behind the Syrian government. They kept it on its feet, they fed it with resources, they sent their kids to war in order to defend themselves. That's the way I see it. So in my opinion, this movement failed from day one because it failed to unite all Syrians behind one cause. Instead, it split the Syrian society into two halves.
Amar, can I ask you then?
I totally reject the notion that it was the Syrian government failure that led to the depreciation of the Syrian value, of the Syrian lira value, Syrian pound, by more than 30-fold. It's definitely the sanctions. And today we've heard some Arabic initiative, and it clearly said by the Arab League, and it clearly said, well, it's basically saying Syria should go to its natural surrounding, and it's clearly saying that the Caesar, act is not going to help at all if it stays as it is. So it's not only Syrians who are saying the sanctions; it's actually everybody else.
Amar, I have to
ask
you
me something.
What you believe was the alternative, for those who fairly felt they couldn't go on tolerating a dictator and the repression that was a humanitarian crisis in its own right in Syria. What were those people, and there are many of them, you said not all Syrians, but what were those people supposed to do?
Well, first of all, we need to understand that what happened in Syria did not originate in Syria. There was a wave that it started in Tunisia for all sorts of objective reasons, so to speak. I think the main factor for what happened in Syria was the realization by a group of Syrians that this can be done and that the West can come, the NATO namely, could come and probably topple what they see as the regime, exactly as it happened in Libya. In fact, the first demonstration, the major demonstration, first major demonstration took place on March the 18th, exactly one day after the Security Council adopted a resolution on Libya, paving the way for what unfolded later. So this realization, or this hope that we need to do something so that we attract some external help. And I'm not talking about incitement from regional powers. We've seen satellite channels inciting and using very fairly sectarian language and all that stuff. There were all sorts of mobilization factors over there. But this campaign made lots of Syrians suspicious, and some of them felt threatened themselves. So what could have happened at the time, I think we went into a spiral of events. They couldn't come back. They started going to the streets, hoping that everybody else would. When they realized that not everyone was interested in this, and somebody was saying, hold on guys, we don't need this, and we're going to fight against it, they couldn't go back because they were afraid of persecution. I realized that. So from the very beginning, I think we went into this immediately wrong way, and it wasn't the Syrians' fault. It was, some external factors that came in and gave hope to some idea, and that's when everything went wrong.
Okay. Fadel, let me ask you, do you feel it's possible that the original revolutionaries, I'll call them that, maybe underestimated what sectarian issues were potentially at play? They meant to, they wanted to punish Assad, but as we saw perhaps arguably in other countries, it was the dictator himself that managed to keep certain sectarian elements in check. Was there an underestimation of the violence that could erupt from the destabilization of this dictatorship, as unpleasant as it was, making the situation go from bad to so much worse?
I think the main reason is the brutality and the intensive violence from Assad regime from day one, using the gunfire and killing, torturing Syrian people until death, disappeared hundreds of people. That brutality, which is reached based on the OCHA report, based on the High Commissioner report in August 2012, to crimes against humanity, that mean this systematic violence from Assad regime prevent the engagement from other Syrian, and this is reality. This family ruled Syria since 1970. The revolution was the only way. Let me tell you something. This Ba'ath party claim that they have millions of members. They are only nominate only one person from Assad family. So this family will remain forever. So the revolution is actually not an option in Syria. It's a fate. And I think that due to these circumstances, that doesn't mean we will stop or we will stop claiming a regime respect the human rights.
Okay. Rania, I see you agree, but one of the underlying sectarian issues, perhaps I shouldn't phrase it as a sectarian issue, but one of the potential underestimations in bringing this revolution to bear was Daesh, and how it would come to force and manifest in Syria. Would Daesh have become the danger it became had it not been for the revolution itself, where it was allowed, to flourish, especially in Raqqa, and eventually commit the most horrific of atrocities?
First of all, I'd like to comment that there are two sides of extremism here in Syria. There is a sectarian issue, and there is an internal hatred. But it started, and I'm saying this as a Syrian American who grew up in the United States and really never see the sectarian hatred until 10 years ago, when I saw that it was the other side who was just afraid. And I agree with Ammar. I agree with him. Some people went into the revolution thinking and believing that this is going to be something that we can achieve all together. And I know a lot of Alawis and a lot of Durzis and a lot of Christians who went into the revolution believing that we need to have this change for Syria, all of us collectively. And then because of Ali Mamlouk and his gang, of course, under the direction of Bashar, came out Daesh, came out Jabhat al-Nusra. You guys released the prisoners from Saydnaya, and we know what they were directed to do from the beginning. This was all a game to make us Syrians, Ammar, hate each other, and we don't. And I call upon you now, here on TV, I call upon you now to take a second look at your people, to see what kind of suffering is going on, and to understand what your people want, and then come on TV and try to defend Assad again. I cannot believe for the life of me, somebody who is living in the Western world, understanding human rights, understanding democracy and freedom, and goes on TV to defend Bashar al Assad, who is a criminal, who has killed your own people, the people who love you, the people who came out to try to get some dignity. Why? Why are we still trying to say that Bashar is going to stay, or that he is right, or that he's doing his country correctly? He's not, Ammar. He's
Ammar,
not.
go ahead.
Right, Rania, thank you for that statement. Unlike you, I grew up in Syria. I only came to the UK when I was 32 years old. I know that people didn't hate each other. They still don't. Those who refused the revolution wasn't the Alawites or wasn't the minorities. Half of the Sunnis, progressive Sunnis, didn't want it as well. Lots of people didn't. There is actually a coalition of Syrians objectively refusing this revolution. These people, there are so many issues. There are the rural versus urban dynamic. There is also the sectarian. And when I mentioned sectarian, I didn't say that sectarianism was an issue in Syria. I said there was sectarian incitement from the outside. I visited Damascus 3 months ago. This was before the current closure because of the re-spreading or the second wave of Corona or COVID. And people are suffering. And people do not think that their government did a bad thing as much as they're not really thinking or singing the praise because of the performance and everything. I totally agree. But actually they know that it is the sanctions that is hitting at them very hard, that there is no bank that is willing or daring to have any financial transactions for Syrians to do anything, to bring anything into their country. There is very little chance that, please let me finish, that there is little chance that an oil tanker could come to the shore. American forces are occupying the areas where oil and wheat is there. So people are suffering not because of lack of functioning and disability of the government, but because of outside factors. Now, the issue is that people didn't go on and sing the praise for Bashar al Assad so that somebody sits on a chair. They wanted to defend themselves, and this is not the Alawites. This is lots of Syrians. I was born and raised in Damascus, and I know lots of people from all sorts of sects who think the same way. And to think of Syrians as people who do not have interest or don't know what the stakes are, that's not very good. I think basically what happened... Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
80% of the people in Damascus refuse and reject the brutality of the Assad regime. However, they are living under fear. So they're not going to say this to you in person, but when you go inside their homes and you know that inside our walls we are being listened to, when they go inside their homes and they feel safe, they will tell you that they would much rather the Assad regime leave and depart so they can live better. But as far as the sanctions are concerned, I want to tell you that, and I promise you this, Ammar, we're going to do everything we can as Syrian activists to make sure that the sanctions are increased, to make sure that they are more intense, and to make sure that the Assad regime is going to go in a very smart way. Very smart way. We're going to suffocate him financially, politically, militarily, until he understands that it is his destiny to leave Syria.
Okay.
Look, Rania, you're suffocating the Syrian people. They cannot get bread, they cannot get butter, they cannot get sugar. That's what suffocating is. The president or the people of the top echelon, are not going to find it hard to find whatever they need. It's the suffering, it's the people who are suffering.
Rania and Amar, I'm very unfortunately going to have to interrupt you. We are really over time for this segment of the Newsmakers in this panel, but I'd like to thank you all three so much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Quickly before I go, we will leave you with images from Syria's decade of war.